Okay, well, good morning again, everyone, and welcome back to Thursday morning Bible study. And we're going to just jump right in with a little bit of a review of where we were when we left. And today we're going to have a lot of fun. Today I always think of Kathleen Mason when we do these things, that we're going to do graduate level studies here, but you're not getting a degree at the end. So if you remember, we had started with this chapter on marriage and divorce in Mark's gospel. And we talked a little bit about what Mark has recorded here, and we were beginning a conversation about marriage. And what we're really going to do today is look at 4 different passages in the New Testament about marriage, since it's raised a lot of questions. So we'll get to see what the New Testament says about marriage. And then we can talk a little bit about where we as a Catholic Church are today on the sacrament of marriage. So why don't we start by just rereading the passage that we started last week, and I'll summarize where we were, and then we'll look at some of the other passages. So who would like to read chapter 10, verses 1 through 12? Nobody?
I'll read it. I had to read it myself. Okay. I don't know who that was, but go ahead.
Valerie Bourne, I think.
Yeah, and I'm a bit allergy congested, so bear with me. Okay. He set out from there and went into the district of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds gathered around him, and as was his custom, he again taught them. The Pharisees approached and asked, "Is it lawful for a husband to divorce his wife?" They were testing him. He said to them in reply, "What did Moses command you?" They replied, "Moses permitted him to write a bill of divorce and dismiss her." But Jesus told them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate." In the house of the disciples again questioned him about this. And he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery."
Okay. All right, does anybody have any thoughts about what they remembered from a couple weeks ago when we first read this? What sort of things stand in your mind?
Before we get started, you need to co-host me again. When you knocked me out, you didn't re-co-host.
Oh, all right. Let me see
and
if
I can't mute anybody.
All right, I think since I'm not an expert on this, let me do it this way. All right. Okay.
You got me.
You got it? All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so any thoughts about what folks remember from last time, just about this passage?
One thing that stuck in my mind from our last discussion was initially it was the man who divorced his wife, and that was it. But like you said, it also kind of freed her to go on about her life or do whatever she needed to do. But the other thing was that Jesus mentions that she can also divorce him, which I thought, at least in my mind, I drew that distinction that it gave the woman more freedom, and that it was only adultery if they remarried.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so there are a couple thoughts going on there. The first one is that yes, adultery was actually considered a crime against the husband, and only the husband had the ability to divorce his wife. Um, and um, and so yes, so if he did that, he would actually free her from being bound to him, and she could remarry under those circumstances. Um, but again, remember, this is all under the law of Moses. So Jesus is actually going to make it tougher, and he's going to say that you can't divorce, right? Remember, Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. Um, but what Jesus does is he now makes marriage a little bit more mutual in the sense that at the end, um, either the man or the woman can commit adultery against the other, right? Because in the past, only the woman could commit adultery against the male, or another man could commit adultery against a man by, sleeping with his wife. But so under the original law, adultery was a crime against the husband. Now, in essence, it could be a crime against both the husband and the wife. Um, but remember, Jesus is not permitting divorce. He's saying that they are no longer two, but one, and therefore what God has joined, no human being must separate. So he's being tougher on them than Moses. Any other thoughts from what you remember?
I have a question, Father.
Uh-huh.
Um, before I became a Catholic, I divorced my first husband. So that meant I was an adultery too.
Well, we'll go and talk more generally about all those things, okay, rather than any in specific case, because it's, our law of marriage has gotten much more complex than that. So remember what we were saying as a potential out here is therefore what God has joined together, no human being must separate, right? But suppose God didn't join them together. All right, so there's a potential here that maybe the marriage wasn't of God, and if it wasn't of God, then perhaps it can be separated. Remember that little out that we talked about. Um,
About
but
that,
over
like civil marriages, like they go down to courthouse, or they'll have a friend or somebody marry them in their
right,
home
well,
or in the
Well,
garden.
we're gonna talk a little bit more about that as we talk about modern times. So back in Jesus's time, there really wasn't an idea of civil versus religious marriage. I mean, there was just marriage, um, and um, and so he's being very strict about that marriages are not able to be dissolved, at least if they were joined by God. If the two people were joined together by God. Okay.
So, and also, I think we talked about the Orthodox Jews where the law still today gives the husband the right to give his wife a bill of divorce.
Exactly. So that practice of only the husband being able to divorce the wife, not the wife being able to divorce the husband, is still
Right.
practiced among Orthodox Jews today, and it can be controversial for the reason that even Esther was saying, because if he will not divorce her, then she cannot remarry, because she needs that bill of divorce in order to be freed of her previous husband so she can marry again. So as we look at this passage, so I want you to keep a couple things in mind before we go on to the next one. Remember, Mark's gospel is the first of the three gospels to be written. Okay, so this is the first gospel that is recording this teaching of Jesus. Okay, so when we look at it according to Mark, it's pretty strict. There's no obvious exception being made for allowing divorce. Um, but he also is seeing marriage as mutual. in the sense of adultery can be committed by the wife against the husband or by the husband against the wife. Okay? So just remember those points. So far, so good? All right. So now let's
Father
look.
Rich, excuse me, can you
Yes.
repeat that about the mutual part?
So in Jesus's mind, the rule about adultery is mutual. In other words, under the old law, it was only something that could be committed against the husband. But there was no crime of adultery against the wife. But now Jesus is seeing adultery as something that can be committed either against the husband or the wife. So when he says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery, presumably against him. So it's a mutuality rather than just being one way.
Father, I have a
Yes.
question. Could
Mm-hmm.
this possibly have been fuel for the Pharisees and Sadducees that were trying to find things against Jesus because he's changing or amending Moses' law,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
laws of
So
Moses?
he's it got it right up here, right? They asked him the question because they were testing him.
Yeah.
And now he's giving a stricter law than Moses. And I don't know, they may have been surprised. Maybe they thought he was going to be even more liberal, than Moses. But he's being stricter than Moses. So this is how Mark responds or records Jesus's response. Let's look at Matthew. So Matthew, he addresses this similar issue in chapter 19 of Matthew's gospel. So who would like to read Matthew 19:1 through 12?
I'll read it.
Okay.
When Jesus finished these words, he left Galilee and went to the district of Judea across the Jordan. Great crowds followed him, and he cured them there. Some Pharisees approached him and tested him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatever?" He said in reply, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate." They said to him, "Then why did Moses command that a man give the woman a bill of divorce and dismiss her?" He said to them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If this is the cause of a man with
No,
his
if
wife,
that's the case,
if that is, I'm sorry, I can't see. If that
yeah.
is the case with his wife, it is not, it is better not to marry." He answered, "Not all can accept this word, but only those to whom that is granted. Some are incapable of marriage because they were born so. Some because were made so by others. Some because they have renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Whoever can accept this ought to accept it."
Okay. All right. So what are your initial reactions of this one?
He gave them a lot of things to think about there. I mean, it's more in Matthew than
A little
Wow.
bit, huh?
Yeah.
yeah,
Very different. Yeah.
yeah.
So what do you notice?
Well,
Mm.
he said, first thing I saw was whoever in verse 9, whoever, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful. That struck me right there. What do you
Okay.
mean by unlawful? What does he mean by that?
All right. That's right. So that's a question, but you see that like he puts an exception right in there. Did
Yes.
was that exception in Mark?
No.
No.
No, it's not, but it's in Matthew. Yeah, so that's a question. What does that mean? It's the marriage is unlawful. And then of course that asks immediately the question, did Jesus say that and Mark left it out? Or did Matthew just add it in? Because he was kind of, oh well, Jesus couldn't possibly have meant that you can't divorce in an unlawful marriage, right? So is that a commentary that Matthew is adding to what Jesus said?
Right. And then for me, that raises the question of laws and different times in history. Who's decided the law as to what's lawful and what's unlawful? Then it may have been different than our laws now. I mean, in most cases it is. And in what countries? So that raises a lot of questions for me.
Okay. Now, do
And
you
I
get?
was just
Go ahead.
thinking, unless the marriage is unlawful, how about common law marriage, where two people get together and decide they're married, but they don't go to any body to, you know.
Okay. Well, yeah, but I would say right now that yeah, don't add common law marriage. That's a modern concept.
Okay, so
That
I
wouldn't
just
have
trying to
been.
figure out what this meant. You know, I thought
Yeah.
maybe that meant that.
Well, let's go a little bit further down because it seems like this other conversation seems a little odd, but maybe it has something to do with what's lawful and unlawful. So, so D is right. You see right away this exception, unless the marriage is unlawful, that isn't in Mark's gospel. But then there's this added conversation that also is not in Mark's gospel. And what's that conversation about?
That conversation leads I don't know how to say it leaves a lot to be desired and interpretation for me because he says some are incapable of marriage because they were born so or made so by others. That sends red flags all over the place for me because others have renounced marriage. That I can understand because religious renounce marriage. You know, if you become a priest or a nun, you know, sister. Um, but the other two really leave, again, questions.
Well, what do you think he's talking about in those other two? Was he talking about in being incapable of marriage because you were born so or you were made so?
Maybe people who have mental disorders or certain disabilities that
Okay.
cannot, in other words, they can't make a, a rash decision. They can't make a logical decision as to whether or not marriage is appropriate because they don't have that capability.
Okay. That certainly would be certainly in modern times how we might, we certainly would add that. Not,
I'm thinking,
go ahead.
I'm thinking maybe they were gay. You know, they
Maybe
had
they
gay
were
people
gay.
back then. They had gay people back then.
Yeah. Although their understanding of that would have been different from ours. They would have known that there are people who engage in sexual activity with the same sex.
Uh-huh.
They would not have had a concept of orientation like we do, like you're attracted either to the same sex or to the opposite sex. So orientation would not have been a concept for them as it is for us today.
Love it.
Um,
Incapable of marriage because they were
so
born
so
so.
you know, let's get a little
Okay.
bit more basic. Let's get a little bit more basic about what happens in marriage and what marriage is supposed to be about in back in those days.
Marriage was supposed to be about you
Go
know,
ahead. Don't be
reproduction.
shy. We're all adults.
Reproduction. Let's put it that.
Reproduction.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a reference to the ability to engage in sexual intercourse, basically. And the ability to reproduce, because that was, in ancient times, all the way up till today, until modern times, that was considered a fundamental purpose of marriage, right? Was to reproduce and have children and raise families. And so some are incapable of marriage because they were born so. What do you think that means?
Could it be because of their sexual organs itself?
Yeah, I mean, it has something to do with their ability to engage in sexual intercourse. So, think of a man who is permanently impotent, for whatever reason. And so as a result, he cannot engage in sexual intercourse. So he would be incapable of marrying if he were not able to have sex. What might be a reason others were made so by others?
Decapitated. I mean,
Oh,
Not
eunuchs.
decapitated. Eunuchs, right?
Eunuchs.
Castrated.
Yeah, castrated.
castrated.
Yeah. So I remember that was a very standard practice for men who were entrusted to look after, normally in royalty, men who were entrusted to look after the female members of a royal household. They would be castrated, presumably to prevent them from having either sexual interest or certainly having sexual intercourse with the women they were supposed to be looking after. So castration would be a reason that they could not marry. Okay. And then the third reason given, go back to what Esther said. What is that? Because they have renounced marriage. They've made a choice not to marry for the sake of the kingdom. And so they presumably can physically marry. They can physically engage in sexual intercourse, but they choose not to marry, and therefore, as we're told in another passage, they are eunuchs for the kingdom. Okay, so maybe this has something to do with the exception of being an unlawful marriage, right? You see what I'm saying? If you connect these, Matthew is maybe either Matthew or Jesus is creating an exception, that if perhaps you entered into a marriage and then it turned out that the couple could not engage, they could not consummate the marriage, then that might be a reason the marriage was unlawful and therefore a divorce could be granted. Are you following that?
Yes.
Okay. So that could be, we don't know for sure, but that could be what that reference to an unlawful marriage is, that it may have something to do with the couple's ability to engage in sexual intercourse and consummate the marriage. Was Jesus one of these categories?
I would say yes.
I
What
think he
kind?
was that
He was
last
Yeah.
the
one.
last one. Yeah, for the kingdom of
Yeah.
heaven. He remains
Right.
unmarried. Yeah.
So yeah, so this is the understanding of why Jesus. I mean, Jesus was in his 30s, and it was unusual for a man of that age not to be married. There were cases though where people could, because of a vow, renounce marriage. And so the thought is that Jesus had, made a vow to renounce marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and that's why he was not married. Not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. All right. And then as Esther said, we certainly have a long-standing history in the Christian community of religious making a vow of celibacy, of renouncing marriage for the sake of the kingdom. Celibacy is not unique to Christianity. It was not as practiced in Judaism, but we know, for example, in some of the Eastern religions like Buddhism and there certainly were celibate monks in those traditions. So celibacy is not, an aberration. Is it aberration or aberration? It's not an aberration. Well, it's not thoroughly unusual. The idea exists in a variety of cultures. Okay, so go ahead.
Numbering.
I guess we'll get there. I'm just moving ahead of here. So you know that some people think he was married.
Some people have said that. Most scholars would not agree with that. There's very, very, very scant evidence of Jesus ever having been married. The feeling is that had he been, there would have been some direct reference. That idea that he was married comes from his relationship with Mary Magdalene.
Right.
And it's clear he had a special relationship with Mary Magdalene. It's not clear at all that there was a sexual relationship. Some of the writings that are not part of the Bible do imply a sexual relationship between, or at least a romantic relationship between Jesus and Mary, but even none of them even says that they were actually married. So there is no evidence that no direct evidence that Jesus was married in any of the writings that we have, either whether they were in the Bible or not in the Bible. But I personally just think that it makes for good novels. So, people promote that idea, but I would have to say, uh, regardless of what his relationship with Mary Magdalene may have been, I think it's highly unlikely they were married. I can't imagine that there could be all of these writings about Jesus and there not be one mention of him being married, if he in fact had been married.
I have a question, Father.
Yes.
Verse 12, yes, some are incapable. No, no, right here, because they have renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. This is a direct quote from Jesus, right? It's not red letter in your
Right. I mean,
view.
Matthew is recording it as a quote. Yes.
Okay. So how during the Reformation, how is it that the Protestants don't honor this? Because they marry,
Right.
different pastors and people of the church in the Protestant flavor, they all marry, but they're not taking this into consideration that this was a direct quote from Jesus.
Well, first of all, there's not a commandment here, even if this is a direct quote from Jesus. He's not
Yes, yes.
requiring people to be married. And again, as a historical matter, there is historically in Catholicism even two kinds of priests. There are priests that are part of religious orders, right? And then there are what we call the secular priests or diocesan priests. So I'm a diocesan priest. I'm not a member of a religious order. Um, Diocesan priests were permitted to marry all the way up to the 11th century.
Right.
So even Catholics for 1100 years permitted their clergy to marry.
Even the Pope was
It,
married. Even
it
the
was
early popes were married.
yeah,
Okay.
it was just their it was those who were part of religious orders who took a vow of celibacy. And then in the
Okay.
11th century, the church imposed that vow even on the secular or diocesan priests. So, and that's how even today, I take a vow of celibacy. But anyway, so the fact that Protestants have married clergy doesn't negate this. What's interesting is they don't have any kind of tradition of celibacy, which is interesting. So they've sort of not recognized celibacy as anything of particular value. Whereas, even among Episcopalians, even though their clergy can marry, they do have some folks who can take vows of celibacy, as part of a religious commitment. So even though they don't require folks to be celibate, if somebody chooses to be celibate, they honor that. So that is an interesting question that Gretchen raises, is that the idea of celibacy or the value of celibacy as a witness has been lost in the Protestant communities. We'll I think we may get to that a little bit when we get to Paul's letter, but for now, so you see how Matthew's is different overall? There's a direct exception unless the marriage is unlawful, although we're not sure exactly what that means. But then it's also coupled with this conversation about celibacy, and that may have something to do with, the lawfulness if it's around a couple who, for example, cannot consummate their marriage. And there has always been a long tradition, even in the civil cases, of, that ability to consummate a marriage has always been considered part and parcel of marriage. Not necessarily the ability to reproduce. So a couple can be infertile, right? But they have to be able to consummate their marriage in order for the marriage to remain, in most traditions, a valid marriage. So maybe that's what the reference to an unlawful marriage is. Are you ready to go on to Luke? All right, let's look and see what St. Luke
Yes.
has to say. Let's see. We want to go to Luke chapter 16. And all right. So here we are. Luke only has one
What?
verse. Okay. So who wants to read Luke chapter 16 verse 18?
I'll read it.
Go ahead.
Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And the one who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery.
All right. So what's your impression here?
Well, that just reminded me of John condemning Pilate in this for marrying his brother's wife.
Oh, not Pilate, Herod.
Herod for marrying his brother's wife. That reminded me of that when I read this.
Okay,
And he makes
although,
it
yeah, I mean, although that was more related to marrying, the brother's wife.
right.
This is really just anybody. So there were actually laws around that, additional laws around marrying, the brother's wife, which Herod had, according to John the Baptist, had run afoul of. But how does that relate here? What's he saying?
Well, the man who divorces his wife and marries another is committed against adultery against his wife, his first wife. And the one who marries that same woman, he also commits adultery.
All right. Now, first of all, it's interesting. We have the word everyone and one. Is it really anyone or any one person? who is every
Yeah.
one and one?
The man.
The man. Okay.
Yeah, the man.
In both cases, it's man. So we don't have the mutuality, right?
Right.
That we had in Mark, right? Remember in Mark, the wife can commit adultery and the woman can commit adultery, right? I mean, the wife can commit adultery and the husband can commit adultery, right? But here, who's the one committing adultery?
The man
The
entirely.
man.
Yeah.
The man. So if a man divorces his wife and marries another, the man commits adultery. And the man who marries a woman who was divorced, that man commits adultery. So you see that? So it's a little subtle, but there's no mutuality here. It's all about the man committing adultery. Whereas in Mark's gospel, there's the mutuality. What else what's so obvious about what Luke has done here?
He just shortened it. He just shortened, paraphrased it.
He he's eliminated the whole conversation,
yeah.
right? He
Yes.
completely gets rid of it, and he just sticks in this one line: everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and the one who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. So he doesn't really go into it at all, right?
Right.
So, go ahead.
Hey, no, I guess I'm thinking out loud. And based on, and of course, I don't know the personalities of the gospel writers, but could that have had something to do with who Luke was? He was the physician, right?
Yes.
And
I
I
mean,
would have,
that's what tradition says he was.
right, but I would have expected him to be a little bit more detailed. And maybe he was just straight up, nope, this is the law, whatever,
This is
and
it.
boom, that's it.
Yeah. And I don't know. I haven't done that much research on this to know why Matthew, what it is about the actual writer, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, that causes them to write it differently. But what's the first thing you can say about quoting Jesus by reading all three of these?
Mostly, I would say it's consistent,
Is
even
it?
though, well, kind of, even though it's shortened, it is consistent that the man is the one that commits adultery, except in which one is that?
Mark.
Matthew, Mark, except for Mark, but that's consistent with everything that the man is the one who commits adultery, and
But what about generally about the whole discussion of marriage and all that kind of stuff? What do you have to say about quoting Jesus here?
I don't know. The first word that came to my mind was, and maybe this is stretching it a little bit, but liberator, because Jesus was beginning to make man and woman more equal in this marriage situation than, especially as he says it in Mark, than any of the other writers indicate. But Jesus was kind of evening the field. So I always think of Jesus as a liberator.
Okay, I would agree with you that if you're reading Mark's version.
Mark, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So what I'm saying,
I
because it
guess
kind of goes back to what Gretchen had asked about, earlier about these quotes of Jesus. I think what I take from this is we have to be careful about being absolutely sure about what Jesus said, because you have three different gospel writers and they're quoting him differently. Okay? They don't they don't some of them are the same, but some of them are different. So in Mark, you have whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And then in Matthew, you have whoever divorces his wife unless the marriage is unlawful and marries another commits adultery, right? And then you have Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and the one who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Okay. They're they're all a little bit different.
Let me say this. To me, they all sitting there listening to what Jesus said, and I'm going to say I do this too. So we're listening to Jesus. Maybe I say we're listening to you as you do your homily, and we're listening, but we're also taking parts out of the homily that we think is important to us. So if I'm going to relate that to somebody else, what did Father Rich say today about his homily? Okay, he was talking about everybody who divorces anybody else commits adultery, and if I marry somebody else, I commit adultery. He commits adultery.
Okay.
Just
Uh,
and that's what I think they all took away what they thought was important. And Luke just summed it up in one little line that he thought was important. And then Mark and took a little bit further. And Matthew really, he took it a little bit further.
okay,
So it's just
that's excellent. That's exactly what I think why I'm doing this. I think one of the things it's very it's threatening to a lot of people because it's hard. We don't know what Jesus actually said, right? We're being told by three different writers what Jesus actually said. And Dee is exactly right. When someone tells us what another person says, you're getting what they heard and what they thought was important about what the other person said. Okay. There were no tape recorders back then, and nobody was running around following Jesus, quoting, writing everything he said down. These are what people are remembering him saying. So we always have to be very careful when we say, well, those were Jesus's words. That's it. That resolves it right then and there. It's the end of the conversation. Jesus said it. That's what the answer is, right? Because we can't really be sure about exactly what Jesus said. Okay. So what we're getting in the Bible is what the writer is telling you that Jesus said. And that's based on what he thinks is important and what he's heard and what he remembers or what has been passed down to him by what other people remember, right? So does that mean that we just throw it all away because we can't depend on any of it?
I
No,
was gonna I was
no.
gonna say something like that. So, they got people who says, or they got songs who says, if the Bible says it, I believe it.
Right.
So I'm a little bit confused because if it's only what the writers is saying, how do we interpret it what we need to believe and do because of this writing?
All right. So that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, but I always learned that the Bible, I mean, I listen to some people when they want to start quoting chapter verse and all of this stuff from the Bible. From this conversation, it makes me even more of the way of aware of the fact we cannot be judgmental because people want to pick and choose scripture or things that they see in the Bible and judge other people by what, oh well, the scripture says blah 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 blah, and they want to be judgmental as to whatever's going on in somebody else's life. But I always learn that the essential truths is what drives us forward. And, maybe there's certain different interpretations, but there is an essential truth in everything that's divinely inspired. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yes. No. All right. So now we're getting close. Okay. We're getting there. So so it isn't a free for all, right? We don't just throw up our hands and say, well, we can't trust anything in the Bible, right? Because as Esther says, we know that the scriptures are inspired. And so we know that there are certain truths that the Bible is trying to convey to us, okay? But when we read the actual words, we see there are differences. So we as Catholics certainly, because we're not literalists or fundamentalists, we it just pointing out a word in the Bible doesn't prove anything. Okay? Because we don't, if you did that, you've got 3 different words here coming from Jesus. So what do? We have, as Dee says, we have to start interpreting these words, right? And try to search for that truth that Esther says is in there. And who gets to do that? Who gets to read all of these words and starts to interpret them to decide what the truth is? Who gets to do that?
We do.
We do,
We being whom?
all of us,
We the people with help of
all
the
of
Holy
us.
Spirit, right? But the Holy Spirit helps with that.
All right. Well, see, now that's going to be the big question for the different denominations, because in the Catholic Church, do we, the people, decide what the Bible says?
So
No.
the Pope and the clergy.
Right. Well, the tradition of the church, as defined ultimately by the Pope and the clergy, the bishops, that's how we ultimately decide, right?
Right.
Does that mean the people are irrelevant?
No,
No.
No, because your life experience informs, what we understand, and that all kind of goes through a process. But let's be clear, in our tradition, the people don't decide. It's not like we have conventions every now and then and we put it to a vote, right? That when we read the scripture, it's over the centuries that the clergy, listening to the people, looking at tradition, begins to interpret it and begins to kind of develop rules and regulations around our interpretations. How do other denominations do it? It's not every
Let me go
denomination
back
do
to the
that.
Catholic bishops and whatever.
Okay.
Over the years, in the interpretation of looking at the people, they are so slow getting to that when the people part.
They're
They
very
awfully
slow.
slow as putting it together because it's taken. It seems like it's taken centuries or decades before they understand what where the people come. Like now, where the people are coming from.
What's an advantage of that? Why do you think it's so slow?
I think sometimes I think they're out of touch with the people.
Anybody want to give another impression of why it might be good for it to go slowly?
I think that because you give it a chance to peak or to the excitement of it to kind of be tried.
Yeah, you
yeah,
want to
It has
test
to be,
it. You want to
yes,
Right.
it
test.
has to be
They want to
tested and
make sure
tried.
that
that's
So you have to
Yeah.
realize this is the frustration that Dee expresses is actually a modern Western phenomenon. Okay, those of us in the West who are now very highly educated and high means of communications and compute, we want everything to happen yesterday. Okay, whereas the church, the way the church looks at it, we've been around. It's been 2,000 years already. What's the rush, right? So if it takes another century or two, but the church looks at it from a perspective of, yeah, we want to make sure that this isn't just a fad we're signing on to. We
Now,
want to make sure something survives the test of time. So really, it's out there in the parishes and among the people. That's where we're doing all the experiments. But in
I
the
just have
long
to say,
run, it takes time for the larger church to kind of go along with it all.
so it takes this long for the church to realize that there's racism in this church, and it's taken them this long to figure this out, and they're still talking about just getting to the point where they want to talk about it.
Oh,
It's still taking that's a long time.
all right. That first of all, it does take a long time. I mean, the church isn't the only one who's just coming to terms with racism, right? And it's been going on for centuries.
Yes.
So in the idea though of racism and how that's a little bit different from what we're looking at here. We're looking at doctrine, and about gospel
Okay.
truths. I mean, I think, but I mean, clearly it took time for the church to develop an understanding around slavery being wrong. But actually, in that, the church was well ahead of the United States on that. The U.S. was one of the last countries in the world to give up on slavery.
That's right.
So, but I don't want to confuse that issue with some of these broader concepts like we're talking about of like fundamental issues like marriage. It takes time for these things to develop. But ultimately, you can't just point to the scripture and passage and say, there's the answer. Because as we're seeing, it's a little bit tougher than that, right? Because it depends then which passage are you pointing at. Let's go on. I just want to get the last piece on before we finish this. Let's look at a different passage from not from one of the Gospels, but from St. Paul. And this, I think, you'll find a little interesting here. So we're at First Corinthians, and Paul is giving them a whole list of things about how they should behave around issues of sexuality, and then he talks about marriage. So we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. The first bit is all about really sexual conduct, and whether someone should remain married or unmarried or anything like that. But I want to, so that we don't go through the whole thing, I want to start here at verse 10, where he begins to address to those who are married. Now, remember, this is St. Paul. He writes long before the Gospels are written. So, in fact, this is the first time we're reading, in the New Testament about marriage, because St. Paul is the first of the New Testament writers. So, who wants to start with St. Paul at verse 10? And we're gonna read all the way down to verse 16.
To the married, however, I give this instruction, not I, but the Lord. A wife should not separate from her husband. And if she does separate, she must either remain single or become reconciled to her husband. And a husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she is willing to go on living with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he is willing to go on living with her, she should not divorce her husband. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through the brother. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, whereas in fact they are holy. If the unbeliever separates, however, let him separate. The brother or sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Wow,
All right.
changed everything around.
All right. So, what do you think of that?
Wheezy. Oh, wow.
All right,
He just
let's take it a piece at a time, okay? So let's take this part, verses 10 and 11. To the married, however, I give this instruction. Not I, but the Lord. What's he saying right there? When he's saying, I give this
Lord.
instruction,
It's
not
not
I,
really
but the
him.
Lord.
Yes, it's not really him giving the instruction.
All right.
It's God giving it.
Yeah, it's Jesus.
Yes.
So what he is about to say is what Jesus taught, right? And he says Jesus taught a wife should not separate from her husband. And if she does separate, she must either remain single or become reconciled to her husband. And a husband should not divorce his wife. Right? Is that consistent with what Jesus said?
Pretty much.
Yeah, it
I was
is.
going to say the same thing, pretty much.
Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
consistent with what
Hmm.
Jesus said, right? So one and now and again, remember Paul's the first is the earliest. So he's got the earliest memories, right? Paul is writing around the 50s when he writes this. So it's about 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, whereas Mark writes in the 70s, or at the earliest in the late 60s. So Mark is writing at least 35 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And Matthew and Luke are writing in the 70s, so they're almost 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. So clearly you can say Jesus was pretty tough on the issue of marriage, right? He was not a fan of divorce. And you can see even Paul acknowledges that. A wife should not separate from her husband, and a husband should not divorce his wife. So far, so good? Are you with me?
Yes.
All right.
Yep. Yes, we are.
Now the rest. I say, not the Lord. What's that mean?
What
His
he feels.
instruction now.
It's his
Right.
opinion.
Right.
This
Yeah.
is now
Exactly. It's
right.
Paul's interpretation.
This is now going to be Paul's instruction,
Right.
right? Not the Lord. And what now this is a little complicated, but it'll make sense to you once you break it down. What does Paul instruct them? All right.
Anyone that has a
If a
wife or
well, not anyone, any
brother,
all right, what's a brother in this context?
A believer.
man,
A believer, a
believer,
Christian, right? If any Christian male has a wife who is an unbeliever. All right. So now what you have is you have a Christian who is married to a Gentile. Well, no, I shouldn't say
Mhm.
Gentile, to a non-Christian, right?
Mhm.
Okay. If she is willing to go on living with him, then what?
He should not divorce her.
Right. So a Christian who is married to an unbelieving wife who wants to stay in the marriage, he should not divorce her. Okay. And then he does the same if any woman has a husband. Now notice he doesn't call her a sister. It's interesting. Has a husband and he is willing to go live with her, she should not divorce him. Right? So what do you see there that's similar to what Jesus is doing? What do you see? Is there a mutuality or is there an immutuality?
He's giving the woman
It's
the
a
rights here.
mutuality.
Jesus did.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
mutuality, right? What's good for
Right.
the
Yeah.
what's good for
What
the
goes
goose
for
is
the
good for
goose
the
is good for
gander.
the gander.
So he is in many ways Paul is reflecting Jesus's approach, right? So it's not just that it applies to the man, it also applies to the woman. All right, so the first instruction for Paul is if you're a Christian and you're married to a non-Christian and they want to continue with the marriage, you should not divorce them. Okay? But if the unbeliever separates, let him separate. The brother or sister is not bound in such cases. So what's he saying there?
It's permissible to divorce that person if they're an unbeliever. Let them go.
And then if you divorce, what does that allow you to do?
Well, it would allow them to remarry.
It would allow you to remarry. So St. Paul has created an exception to divorce, to Jesus's teaching on divorce, right? He's saying in the case where there's a couple and one is a Christian and one is not, if the non-Christian leaves the marriage, then the Christian is no longer bound by that marriage, and the Christian can remarry. Did you understand that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So my question is, where does St. Paul get off making an exception to Jesus's teaching?
I don't know. I guess with Paul, when he's thinking, because a couple of things were going through my head. First of all, if a believer and an unbeliever are married, it's probably hoped that the person who is the unbeliever will come to believe through the person who is the Christian. And I think that's why he talks about that makes the children holy. But if that unbeliever does not go that path, then it's probably better because they may cause damage or harm to the person who is the believer with respect to their faith and whatever else. So, in Paul's interpretation, it's better if that unbeliever is out of the picture, so to speak, that, they no longer influence the believer not to believe in Jesus Christ. And I can't remember where I saw or read or heard this, but I've heard about people in marriages being unevenly yoked. Is Have you ever heard that? In other words, this would be that situation where there's a believer and an unbeliever, and if you're unfairly yoked, that unbeliever is the one who could create harm in the marriage.
Okay, I mean, I'm personally not familiar with that terminology, but I can see what you're saying. So
It's usually a Protestant terminology. They use it a lot.
that's okay.
Yeah, that
So
unevenly yoked thing.
so
Okay.
do you think Paul is making an exception to Jesus's teaching, or do you think he's making an interpretation to Jesus's teaching that says that Jesus's teaching does not apply to the situation of a Christian and a non-believer?
I think it's his interpretation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
his
think it's
interpretation.
his interpretation.
yeah, I think you can say that. I mean, because he's pretty clear that Jesus did not say this, right?
Right.
It's not clear that this is inconsistent with Jesus's teaching. So if you interpret, remember, this goes back to what God has joined together, right? If you interpret that to apply that, like, kind of God only joins together two Christians, right? Two believers. Then when two believers are joined together in marriage, then they shouldn't divorce. But if a believer and an unbeliever are joined together, are in marriage, then they're not really necessarily joined together by God. And there could be, Jesus's teaching wouldn't necessarily apply to them. And so Paul, as a pastor here, can make an exception based on what Esther was saying, rather than create harm in the community of believers, allow believers to get on with their life if the unbeliever decides to leave the marriage. All right. So are your heads all spinning now?
Yes, divorce is such a controversial question.
It is, and that's exactly that's the one thing I want you to take away from this. I don't expect any of you to remember all the rules and regulations that are coming out of this. And if someday, if you want to talk about that, that's a discussion for another day. What the whole point of doing this is to show you how complex certain issues are, and in particular, how complex the issue of marriage is. That anybody who tries to present this as an easy issue, and there it is in the Bible, that's the answer, isn't isn't reading the Bible very carefully. Okay.
Yeah.
So what we did today was we saw 4 different passages in the New Testament that dealt with marriage, but it didn't make it easy, did it?
No.
It
No.
shows us how complex it is. And
Father
and the
Rich, is Paul saying to remain unmarried or be reconciled with your husband? Not
if well, it appears that Paul is saying if you are both Christians and you separate, then you should not remarry. But if one is a Christian and one is a non-Christian and you separate, then the Christian can remarry.
Mm.
Okay.
But you know, it's still
that
a
is
whole
so
lot of stuff.
confusing.
It's still a lot of interpretation. You know, so so does that mean that okay, I'm divorced and I'm a Christian. I can't get remarried. Did not say that I can't have a relationship with somebody else. I just can't get remarried.
Well, I mean, you got to be careful about that. You should not be having sexual relationships outside
Right.
of marriage.
That's what I'm saying.
Exactly.
It's
Right.
not
So,
saying all of that.
so,
But
so you,
then, but then I look at how the Catholic Church has gotten around that with annulment.
right. Yeah. So this is all, and I don't want to go into all the rules of
Right.
annulments and everything. And we can do that another time. But,
Okay.
but the
This is
whole,
too much.
exactly. And the point is, if you're confused, you should be,
I am confused.
because this is very complicated. And so to me, anybody who tries to tell you the issue of marriage is simple, you just need to read the Bible and it's all there in black and white, obviously isn't reading the Bible very carefully. Because even the Bible creates confusion around this, right? And it requires interpretation around it. And in the Catholic Church, what we do is, we give authority to our bishops, to interpret the Bible and to make rules and regulations around it. And that's why we have the whole laws of marriage that we have, because our bishops over the centuries have tried to interpret and reinterpret and try to understand, what Jesus and what Matthew, Mark, and Luke and what St. Paul are all saying in these passages. And they try to make it relevant to how we're living in today's world. And so it's a very complex structure that has been developed. And part of that is because it's a complex issue. It's not that simple. And really that's all I want you to take away from this is that marriage is not an easy topic. And just reading one passage of the Bible on marriage isn't enough to understand what the Bible says about marriage. And that even when you do read all of the passages, now your head starts to spin because it's so complicated.
And people are
But
going to do what they want to do.
right. So why did we do this? I just want to do this so that I would say, as a pastor, to warn you. One, don't necessarily fall into other people's traps of saying this is what the Bible said, therefore that's the answer. It's not that easy, but also to warn you not to do the same, right? Not you shouldn't be pointing at passages of the Bible and telling somebody, see, that's what it says, that's the answer, no more discussion.
And I think
That's
that's
not that simple.
I think that's what Jesus did when the Pharisees quoted Moses, that he didn't contradict Moses. What he did was he just enhanced what Moses said instead of getting trapped into their question.
Well, I think at best he said it's a little bit more complicated than all that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, so that's sort of where I'd like to end this discussion, so we could go back to the Gospel of Mark. and continue to read it. But I wanted to spend some time on it because as you all know, marriage is a sensitive issue, and marriage in the Catholic Church is a sensitive issue. And there's a reason for it. Okay, it's not because somebody sat down and decide how can I make everybody's life complicated and miserable. It's because the Bible itself is presenting complex information. That if you try to say, well, Jesus said this and that's what answers it, well, they're quoting Jesus saying a lot of things, and it doesn't just answer it that quickly. And so we do have to rely on somebody else interpreting it. And in the Catholic Church, we delegate that responsibility to our bishops. In other denominations, it may just be the pastor, right? And the pastor of this congregation interprets it this way. And what happens to when people don't like what the pastor says?
They leave the church.
Yeah, they go find another pastor, right?
Right.
They go find another church where the pastor's going to say something else, So, and that's what happens in the Catholic Church, right? People don't like what the bishops say. What do? They go somewhere else.
I was thinking that about marriage, when they have the consult with you and you tell them that you can't marry them for whatever reason, this is what they have to do, or they just leave you, go down to city hall, get married, and then they come back into church anyway.
Just defy the church, right? Yeah.
Right.
All of those things happen. Now, just again, to set the record straight, many times when I sit down with a couple and says, this is what you need to do to get married, they do it, so they don't all just thumb their nose at it.
Right.
But it can be complex. And it's complex because the Bible is complex, not simply because the Catholic Church is complex. Catholic Church is complex, but so are other churches. But this is an area
Father
that
Rich, excuse me, I was going to say also that the Supreme Court rulings are complex.
Well,
so a combination of everything, and the person is trying to figure out what marriage is all about.
Well,
yeah,
I'm sorry. Well, I was going to say that adds the other complexity that we're not even dealing with is what happens when you say the state, right? The civil law can decide what marriage is. Then what do the churches do in terms of their religious law? And that's exactly where we are today, where the state, and when I say the state, not just the state of Maryland, but even the United States, the state is saying that same-sex couples can marry because they're defining marriage in one way. And now you have certainly the Catholic Church, but many other Christian denominations that say, "Oh no, we're not gonna recognize that, and we're going to define marriage differently." So that adds another layer of complexity to the situation, right? Because now the state says one thing and the church says something else. All of this is to say that marriage is a complex matter. It's a developing matter. It's been developing from the very earliest of times. And so the fact that we're where we are today shouldn't be surprising. And guess what? 300 years from now, we're going to be somewhere else. It's going to continue to develop. And that's just sort of human nature and how the spirit interacts with us. So I just put that out there just to, if your head is spinning, that's a good thing. Not because I want you to be an expert on marriage law. Even I'm not an expert on marriage law. I have to call the canon lawyers and ask, how do I deal with this and how do I deal with that? But to realize it's complex. It's not easy to point to one verse in scripture and say that's the answer. And if there's anything I hope you take from today's session, please do not do that. Do not point to a verse in scripture and say, that's the answer. that's the end of the conversation. Let's move on. It's just not that simple. All right.
Right.
All right. Well, let's put the
Great session.
we'll put